Okay, so tonight we're going to go over the Progressive Era. For much of the way I want to present it, just to keep it somewhat running along according to a timeline that we can understand fairly easily and try to get a hold of all these movements in just about an hour or so. I want to stick much according to the timeline of kind of presidential politics. The Progressive Era is hugely complex because it was more than just national leaders in Congress or the presidential politics rising up and then leading the country in a certain direction. The Progressive Era is largely a continuation of the crisis of the 1890s, and a lot of those crises, especially economic, were not solved. Big businesses dominated national economy. They largely exploited American workers and through kind of refusing to allow unions and all the kind of horrible things that we've talked about before with industrial labor, and of course a lot of racism involved also. So workers are very much kind of pushed aside and used by big business in pretty destructive ways that we've obviously talked about before. So especially in the 1890s, you have a kind of rising up politically of a lot of the working masses that started off with the farmers' movements first, and then brought in the industrial workers into voting politics. And as you get going into the 1900s, they become so mobilized as voters and as citizens who are complaining about the inequities of their life and the society that they live in, that they start taking powerful control over their government again, and they start forcing politicians, often conservative politicians who don't want to do this stuff. People go to them in mass movements and say, if you don't create some reform laws, we're going to vote you out of office, and we don't care who you are. And when they actually start doing that, politicians listen, and they listen closely. So you get a slew of laws from about 1901 going into right around the point where the United States goes into World War I, 1916, 1917. You get a decade and a half of laws, one after another, to address a lot of the social problems that were inherent in American society and are often inherent in early industrializing societies. So people used their voting power and they got results. So a lot of the Progressive Era is much more a history of kind of what we today call grassroots movements, citizen-based movements, voter movements, people who organize themselves in their own communities to force their local congressman or their state senator or governor or even presidential candidate to accept certain reform ideas in order to get elected. So much of the Progressive Era is a history of these much smaller groups kind of interspersed throughout the country, and a lot of them don't communicate with each other all that much. So this term Progressive Era is like an umbrella term that brings in a whole lot of different kind of special interest groups that are based in a kind of massive citizen mobilization. And sadly, a lot of other classes very much overlook the Progressive Era as something that just happened. They kind of push it aside quickly. The Progressive Era is something that's very important for us to understand in our own time, as corporate power has reemerged and largely dominates our politics today. If you've noticed in the political debates, especially now at the presidential election, the two major candidates are largely kind of corporate candidates, if you just pay close attention to their statements. The kind of symbolic leader of the Progressive Era becomes the eventual president. This guy's name is Theodore Roosevelt. He became a popular politician in the 1890s. He was a member of the New York City political machine. So he was involved in New York City and New York State level politics. He had risen up into the McKinley administration, eventually got appointed Secretary of the Navy, which is a high-level position in the federal government, but not something as kind of in the spotlight like a Secretary of War, a Secretary of State, or Vice President, or something like that. So he's one of the lower kind of level bureaucrats at the highest end of the federal government. So he's still one of the guys kind of working in the shadows. I mean, do you even know who your Secretary of the Navy is today? No. So he had risen up to kind of the cusp of national fame in the mid-1890s under President McKinley, when McKinley goes into office in 1897 as president. And McKinley largely led the United States into a war against Spain, largely to fight in Cuba and in the Philippines. When that war broke out, Secretary Roosevelt resigned his position in the government and publicly advertised for basically a bunch of cowboys from the United States to join a kind of private military that over time became known as the Rough Riders. These are basically the tough guys who volunteer their services to the U.S. government. They are not government employees. They are basically volunteer soldiers. And they are largely the big wave of invasion that goes into Cuba. And Roosevelt is their leader, and so you get a lot of kind of cartoons and popular imagery portraying Roosevelt as a national leader, and someone is literally running over the Spanish and leading the Americans forward. So Roosevelt emerges as a very popular politician because the war was so successful, and stories were written and newspaper articles were written on his leading the great charge to defeat the Spanish. Roosevelt is an interesting character. He was not a kind of lifetime tough guy. He wasn't one of these macho kind of kids or bullies or anything like that. He was a kind of nerdy kid who liked to read books and sit in the library. He had glasses. He was a very sick child. He got the flu very often, almost died from it as a kid. So he's kind of skinny, bookish kind of kid all the way through college. And he wanted to be a politician. And he realized that skinny, library-oriented type of people don't usually get into politics very much, right? They don't get into elected office. Because when Americans go to vote, they like to vote for tough guys. So in the late 1800s, as he gets into his 20s and 30s, he literally remakes his own image. He's from a fairly, you don't want to say hugely rich family, but he comes from a family that has some money. So he buys a ranch out in the West. And he makes himself into a cowboy, basically. He creates that image for himself. So he gets known for lifting weights and going off and rustling cattle and doing all this kind of stuff out in the open range. So he was very conscious of the image that politicians had to have in order to win elections. And this is really the final step of it, or one of the final steps that propels him into national fame. He goes to war in 1898 against Cuba, and is immediately the next fall, just a few months after that war ends, is elected governor of New York. So he becomes governor in 1899, and as McKinley is running for re-election as president in 1900, McKinley realizes this is going to be a very close election. So McKinley kicks out his first vice president from his first term and brings in Roosevelt for his VP nominee in order to, get the people on his side. And McKinley actually does win re-election in 1900. So Roosevelt is really the kind of William Jennings Bryan is the Democratic nominee again. He's going to go tour the country again. So Roosevelt becomes like the Bryan of the Republican Party. He goes out and does the national tour. So you start seeing the Republicans taking on a lot of Democratic Party tactics from 1896. And he becomes vice president when McKinley is reelected in 1900. So their official re-inauguration occurs in March of 1901. McKinley is assassinated by an anarchist in, I believe, somewhere around August, September of 1901. He is shot. He lingers for a little while. He lives for a few weeks, I believe, and then dies. So literally you have this guy who's pretty much brand new to the national scene, is now president of the United States. And he's a young guy. He is the youngest president in U.S. history. I'm not certain if it's still up to today, but he was very close to John F. Kennedy. So he has this image of being a very active guy. even as president, he still goes off on hunting expeditions. He still goes off to his ranch in the West and stuff like that. So he is the kind of young, up-and-coming type of person. But he was unknown in a lot of ways to the Republican Party. He was a throw-in onto the national ballot to win McKinley's re-election. So he is a kind of unknown type of person. What does he want to do politically, internationally, as President of the United States? And the moves he starts making as president very much upsets a whole lot of people, and especially a lot of the big Republican Party donors, the big rich companies that McKinley cultivated because they had the money to get him elected. Remember, the Republican Party in '96, in McKinley's first presidential election, literally went to American corporations to take as much money as they possibly could, and vastly outspent the Democrats. So the Republicans are largely the kind of corporate-style party of the late 1890s. They were the most successful at it. And a lot of them did not trust Roosevelt. And Roosevelt starts taking actions against some of the corporations that largely put him and McKinley into office. Roosevelt immediately starts using his powers as President of the United States in ways that are far increased from any president of the late 1800s, probably since Lincoln. Lincoln used presidential powers in just a slew of ways that very much upset the people in Lincoln's own day. They called Lincoln basically a dictator, a lot of Americans did, while Lincoln was alive. So after Lincoln, the idea that the president would try to push Congress to pass certain laws was scary. You know, under the Constitution, the president's not supposed to be really involved in getting laws passed. What's the president responsible for then? Yeah, enforcing the laws that already exist. The president's not supposed to have anything to do with actually writing laws. And Congress had really taken that power back after Lincoln throughout the rest of the 1800s. Roosevelt starts becoming an active president again. So Roosevelt is often called by historians the first modern president who will use congressional majorities, especially of his own party, to push through laws, and he will threaten members of Congress if they vote against what he wants. And this is something that is very obviously true in our own time. Roosevelt and his supporters said that the president should be kind of a manager of Congress. He should be like the CEO of the federal government, and that Congress sometimes has to be prodded to do things. So they said he's just an active manager of Congress. Of course, the people who hated Roosevelt and hate the fact he's doing this called him a would-be dictator. And they literally feared that he is trying to make himself into the dictator of the United States. So that's the major debate that grows within Roosevelt's administration and amongst American society. I mean, this is front-page kind of debate. This is stuff that people are talking about in bars and whatever coffee houses and restaurants existed back then. And he starts using the presidency in ways that had never really been used before. Ever. This is now the early 1900s, and a lot of workers are threatening to go on strike, much like the Homestead strike that we've talked about before, and the Pullman strike. There's a series of strike attempts of workers against their employers, their managers, that starts breaking out in the early 1900s. And they find a fairly accepting president in Roosevelt. And one of the biggest ones that hits is called the United Mine Workers strike, strike of coal miners, where the management, the company, was trying to basically reduce their wages by 10% in order for the company to make more money and stay profitable and stay in business. That was the manager's argument. The coal miners, of course, said they're just being victimized. At this point in time, there are no laws at the federal level and usually at the state levels that demand that employers have to bargain with unions. A lot of times, owners and managers would just, if the union workers want to have a picket and a strike outside, the owners are just bringing new workers. Of course, the strikers didn't like that at all. So oftentimes you get a possible conflict between the newly hired workers that are coming in to do the job on a daily basis. They have to literally walk through the picketers, and that gets dangerous. And a lot of violence, and sometimes riots and fights, violence breaks out, and sometimes people are killed in these strikes. So a lot of presidents, especially President Cleveland in the early 1890s, had used the federal powers, especially the U.S. Army, to go off and force the strikers out, to break the strike. They literally sent in the U.S. Army to force the strikers to stop picketing. And of course that's hugely unpopular amongst the union workers and workers in general throughout the country, because they realize they're under attack. Roosevelt doesn't want to do that. He invites the owners of the mine and the union leaders to the White House to mediate negotiations. He's basically trying to force them into one room and hash out a deal to end the strike and get the workers back to work. Presidents had not done this before. And there's a huge outcry against Roosevelt, saying there's nothing in the Constitution that allows him to do this. The Constitution is largely written in the 1700s. There really weren't many unions back then, at least not on this kind of large, powerful level that could go on strike. So Roosevelt often said that the Constitution is a kind of outdated document in a lot of ways, maybe should be updated. But he also said, my power as president comes from the people, and I have to do whatever is necessary to protect the people. And back then, most people heated their homes with coal, kind of lumps of charcoal, basically. They didn't have the kind of natural gas or the electric kinds of heaters that we have today. So as this strike starts moving in 1902 further and further down the year, and you start getting toward fall when the weather starts getting colder throughout much of the country, Roosevelt says this is a crisis. If there's not enough coal supply, if mine workers are continually going on strike, and people can't afford to buy coal because supply and demand kicks in, then people may freeze to death in their own homes throughout the country. And Roosevelt says that's unacceptable. And he literally said, when interviewed, when it comes to the people freezing to death, to hell with the Constitution. I'm going to do what I need to protect the people. And of course that only opened the door further into people accusing him of being a dictator. He didn't really care about the Constitution in general. But eventually he does mediate negotiations. He eventually threatens to use the army, to send the army in to protect the strikers. So he's siding with the union in a lot of ways and threatening the owners, saying that they're basically a little bit too greedy in this instance. The eventual deal that they reach is to eventually raise the wage of workers, the mine workers, by 10%, so the union will get what they want. But he also will allow some kind of different laws to exist that will allow the company to charge 10% more for the coal that they sell in the open market. So the owners are not going to be hurt economically, and the union gets some higher wages. So both kind of make out in the end. It's largely the coal buyers, the consumers throughout the country, that are the eventual ones who pay for this. But that gives you an insight into what his mindset is. He will do what he views is in the interest of the nation. And he is pretty aggressive in that stuff. That does not mean that he is anti-business or anti-corporation. He says that commerce, big business, is good for the United States, much like many other leading politicians of his era. And most of the leading ones today, the famous ones who get on TV and run for high office, very rarely are they anti-big business. Their public statements are usually pretty much in favor of commerce. And Roosevelt was in line with them. Other politicians of his time said that the business of the United States is business. That's what commerce is the lifeblood of the nation. You get a lot of these different kinds of quotes, and Roosevelt was very much in line with them. And he believed that corporations own private property, they own factories, they own machines, they own land, and that company property should be protected just like any person's individual property, just like your car out here in the parking lot or your computer or whatever else you own. That kind of property is protected by law. And he said the government has the power and the mission to defend property no matter who owns it. But he says that when corporations create monopolies, and he's not even completely against monopolies eventually, he says they have the right to be a monopoly, but if that monopoly starts to hurt what he calls the public interest, if they start jacking up prices for consumers, or lowering wages below anything that's fair, or raising prices beyond anything that people can pay, beyond anything that's fair, he says that the federal government has to take action, because that harms the people. It harms the nation. So he has a kind of balancing act in his own mind, and in a lot of ways his operation as president reflects this. He goes after some corporations and some monopolies when he thinks that they are too dangerous, or they are too wealthy, or they dominate the market to the point where if you want to go buy, say, a gallon of gasoline, you only have one company you can go to. Or if you want to use the telephone. Back then there was largely only one telephone company that operated telephone service throughout the whole country. It was a complete monopoly. And as president, he, as the person who is supposed to enforce laws, there were laws on the books already. There's Sherman Antitrust Act from the 1890s that largely wasn't enforced by other presidents back then. So he took companies to court to break them up. And the most famous instance of this was Standard Oil, the John D. Rockefeller company. So he publicly said that a lot of these antitrust laws that have been put in place sometimes aren't very effective, or sometimes aren't very well written. He sometimes just calls them foolish and lame in a lot of ways. But he recognizes that they are useful, because when companies get to the point of monopoly, they don't have to run efficiently anymore. A company, if you're living in a city and you want to go buy a shovel and there's only one place you can buy a shovel in the whole city, that company doesn't have to operate very intelligently or efficiently. If you want to buy a shovel, you have to go to them. That's the bare bones fact of it. That's real monopolization. So he said that what we want to get to is big businesses can exist, even sometimes monopolies can exist, but when they get so inefficient that they're harming the public good and they're demanding higher and higher profits that harm the people, or they're trying to lower wages down to a point where their employees are going to be basically destroyed, then the government has to intervene to stop that in some way. So he hates the idea of corporate waste. He hates the idea eventually of large companies basically trying to take control of the government. And he hates the idea that these companies harm the public good. So he says that these companies can exist, but you have to have especially a federal government, a national government, that is powerful enough to fight back in the interest of the people. And he calls that the power of regulation. Government has to regulate these companies, because if you let them do whatever they want, they will be destructive. Their thirst for wealth and power is unquenchable. It is unending. And if you let them do whatever they want, they will get so dangerous that they will destroy the national economy and they will harm the public. Roosevelt is interesting because when he runs for re-election in 1904, and we have statements from corporate leaders, he literally went to them and begged them for money to run his campaign. We have statements from them saying that he came to meetings with corporate leaders, quote, hat in hand, like a little child begging for money or begging for candy or something like that. Why would they support him when he's doing all this? Why would they give money to his Republican Party, and especially his own campaign for re-election, if he is making these kinds of statements and using the federal government and the power of the presidency to do this stuff? Any ideas? because he was the politician that was most acceptable to them. The Democratic nominee, again, is William Jennings Bryan. And he is a big-time union type of leader. He is getting pretty close to the Socialist Party in a lot of ways. He's the big Democratic Party person. And the corporate owners really didn't want Bryan in office. And then there's a Socialist Party that starts getting up to about 6 or 10% of the national vote. And obviously they don't want the socialist guy getting in office. Because that guy will probably push, or will absolutely push, for full legalization of unions and collective bargaining. So Roosevelt was their best shot. Even though he is regulating them, even though he is breaking up some companies, the idea to them is that they really don't want the Democrat or the Socialist to get into office. They don't want those parties winning. So they still give Roosevelt money, even though he goes after some of their own companies. One of Roosevelt's major political problems, as the progressive movement gets going under his first term, and we're going to go through some of the laws he kind of pushes through, Roosevelt is overwhelmingly popular. And the Republican Party under his leadership is overwhelmingly popular just with the average voters. So the Republican Party starts to dominate Congress. But his major political problem is that a split emerges within the Republican Party itself. There are a lot of holdover senators and congressmen that were elected in the 1890s under McKinley's leadership that was completely pro-business, entirely. And there's some senators and congressmen that go in and are elected with Roosevelt, who are more reform-minded. So Roosevelt's political problem, especially in Congress, is not so much just getting a Republican majority and overcoming the Democratic opposition to what they want to do. It's cobbling together a Republican kind of unity to pass laws, because they really have an open hand to do whatever they want. So his big political issue really is within his own party, between the reformers that he was pretty much one of the major leaders of, and the old kind of more conservative Republicans who are much more friendly to dominant corporations especially. And that's where the idea of managing Congress comes in. He has to convince certain members of Congress to vote for certain laws and make promises to them, and sometimes threaten them. So questions about any of this so far with Roosevelt? He's a very interesting kind of character. He seems to have a balance of vastly different ideas in his own mind, and he takes different steps when different kind of emergencies present themselves. So he's not one side or the other entirely. He's a mixture. Yeah.
So when he took money from those people that were helping run his campaign, did he have to make any, did he have to get back to him or make any serious?
Oh yeah, he had to make promises. Just like today. President Obama and Governor Romney, they are not going to raise $1 billion without making some promises. That's big, big, big money. Right? Some statistics just came out yesterday about how much those two campaigns raised just last month. Anyone want to take a guess? Yes. In August?
140 million.
Yeah, over $100 million each in 1 month. In just a few weeks, they got a hold of $100 million. You don't get that kind of money just from friends who like you. You get that money from people who want to convince you to do something. And that's the kind of backroom dealing that we still see today. So, absolutely had to make promises. And we have journal entries and diary stuff written by the CEOs of those companies back then that talk about Roosevelt making deals behind closed doors to get the money. That stuff is pretty well known amongst historians. Other questions? Nope. Okay, moving on. Some important laws that are often in textbooks and whatnot. So we're going to go through a quick list and some definitions of what he was doing. One, you get a thing called the Forest Service Act of 1905, and later also a National Conservation Commission. Not full-blown conservationism as we think of it today. Conservation movements today are largely dedicated to drawing out places on the national map that companies are not allowed to use that land at all. The Roosevelt era, the progressive era, was much more watered down than that. They would still allow companies to go into kind of national reserve areas, public land, stuff that is not private property, land that is owned by the federal government. And they just wanted those companies to use that land efficiently. So that shows you the amount of waste and damage that those companies were doing in the 1800s. They would literally go in and destroy mountains to get what they wanted. And they would poison, they would drill oil out of an area, and they would poison water supplies. Because they just didn't care. They're in it to get as much wealth out of the land as possible for their own corporate profit. So this was a major reform just to force companies to use the land wisely and somewhat not, or at least less destructively. So there's a huge amount of kind of ecological damage that was going on in the 1800s. And that caused a mass kind of popular outcry, especially people in the communities around where this is happening. Does that stuff still happen today? Absolutely, without a doubt. There is a form of coal mining today that is literally called mountaintop removal mining, where they literally go into mountains and they blow off the top of the mountain to get the coal out. And they have dump trucks that are 3 times the size of this room to take all that dirt out. It's just monstrously large and hugely destructive. So a lot of this stuff has re-emerged in our own time and is doing great damage to the country's ecology, environment. It's estimated that only 1/3 of American rivers are drinkable now. They're so heavily poisoned. So a lot of this stuff has re-emerged in our own time, and it's another good idea to look back at what government did back then and try to solve problems. There's another one called the National Reclamation Act of 1902. That is largely focused out in the western areas, kind of newly emerging states like Wyoming, Montana, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Idaho. Those largely build irrigation systems out in the west because population centers are starting to rise. When you look at a map of the American population about the year 1900, they're overwhelmingly located from about Chicago all the way eastward to the Atlantic Ocean. And there just weren't many people living out in the western territories, or what were becoming states one by one at that point. So government basically had to go in and build water systems to give enough water for the populations to grow. One of the problems of the National Reclamation Act is it does a lot of good stuff in building up kind of public systems, but it also is imbued with a lot of racism. Parts of it also talk about not allowing Native Americans to own some of this land, to even purchase it, and even taking some of these systems and going into Native reservations, which again are supposed to be foreign countries under U.S. treaties, and enforcing a lot of these kinds of things onto Native reservations where they really had no legal jurisdiction at all. So there's a lot of anti-Native especially, and sometimes some anti-immigrant sentiment that goes into especially the Reclamation Act. Some other ones that become very well known, the 1906 Pure Food Act. This comes out of a lot of stories and books like The Jungle, if you've ever read it, that basically reporters got hired on in secret, got hired into meatpacking places and food producing areas. And they would work there for a few months or a year or something like that to get an insider's view of what's happening in the food supply. And it was pretty disgusting. This is where you get stories of a worker is working over like a giant kind of meat production facility. And if they get their arm ripped off by a machine, the arm just kind of goes into the meat supply. So if you would open up like a can of meat or a package of meat, sometimes you would get like pieces of a finger or something like that. It was pretty nasty stuff. And this is the point where Congress steps in and says they're going to regulate the meatpacking industry especially. And they're going to send federal investigators in to make sure that those kinds of really dirty, disgusting, and dangerous conditions are non-existent. And they fine companies and sometimes even prohibit companies from operating. And that is still in existence today. And this kind of stuff eventually leads to the Food and Drug Administration. And even out in LA County, where you have those graded letters up on the windows of restaurants. You ever seen those? Mostly A's, hopefully. Fairly clean places to eat. But a lot of that comes out of the idea that things had gotten so bad that people are getting sick and dying from buying this stuff and eating it. So the government has to intervene and do investigations and do reports and punish companies for their bad practices. 1906 Hepburn Act sets a maximum price for railroad transportation, which is something, again, that the Granger movement, the Farmers' Unity movements, and the Populist Party had demanded since the 1800s. So they finally get it. And this is one of the examples that shows that even though the Populist Party had really died off by about 1900, 1904, they kind of got merged into the Democratic Party eventually. Their demands are still a big national topic of discussion. And with Roosevelt in office and reform-minded people getting elected into the federal government, into Congress, they pushed this law through finally. So there's a whole lot of others also. This is just a very short list of some of the progressive reforms. There's literally a ton of them. They even start amending the Constitution in several important ways. This is the movement that will eventually give women voting rights. Doesn't happen for another decade after this, but they'll get there eventually. So not just national laws, but the Constitution itself has changed. And if you ever read the list of amendments, they tend to happen in groups, in bunches. You had the first 10, the Bill of Rights. Then you had another few with the end of slavery after the Civil War. And the Constitution really hadn't been amended since then, since we walked into this class, into this semester. And when you get the progressive movement, you get a lineup of new amendments to the Constitution very quickly. So people were very much in the idea of changing things to update the Constitution, update the government to make sure it can deal with all these kind of social crises that were the natural results of industrialization. A lot of the other reforms are killed off in Congress. They do not get majorities, so they don't pass. And these are largely because of the bickering between the progressive Republicans and the more conservatives. So a lot more could have been done if a lot of those kind of pro-business types of representatives and senators hadn't been reelected going forward. All right, so questions about any of that at all? No. All right, that's good. Okay, so Roosevelt is president. He starts in 1901, just a few months into McKinley's second term. There is a tradition that is built up in the United States by this point. And largely, this thing goes back almost 100 years already. That presidents only serve 2 terms. It was started off by President Washington, the first president. He served 2 terms, was elected twice, and after his second term, he retired. He refused to stand for re-election. He basically said 8 years is enough for any one politician to get their program into effect. And if you keep on re-electing one guy again and again and again, you can really build up a kind of monarchy where it becomes very difficult to knock that person out of office. So Washington followed it, Jefferson followed it, Madison, Monroe, Jackson. The most popular politicians of their time had all gone with the 2 terms and then retired. Grant was an exception. He tried to run for a 3rd term and got knocked out. So at the end of basically Roosevelt's second term, because he serves like 7 years and I don't know what it is, like 7 years and 7 months or something. So it's basically 2 full terms for him. He decides to retire in the election of 1908. He is so popular, though, that he can basically handpick the next president. He is so popular that he tells his Republican supporters, I'm not going to run, so vote for this guy. And they all just run and vote for that guy. And Taft wins the 1908 election basically based on Roosevelt's support for him. And he goes into office. 1909, in March of 1909, and in fact becomes an even bigger trust buster than Roosevelt. He's more liberal, more of a reformer than Roosevelt ever was. So he's kind of like Super Roosevelt. He splits up more corporations, more monopolies than Roosevelt did. He passes even bigger conservation laws than Roosevelt ever did. So he goes above and beyond a lot of what Roosevelt was attempting, or had attempted and even done. Taft even takes on the populist demand for an income tax. Taft is a lawyer, and there are certain things in the original Constitution that said that taxation can only be based on the size of certain populations, so it has to be what they called proportional back then. So Taft understood that an income tax would have been unconstitutional. So Taft, in his first term as president, pushes not for a law, because the law probably would have been declared unconstitutional if it went to the Supreme Court. So he pushes instead for a constitutional amendment that would allow an income tax to become law. And it takes him a while, but he eventually gets it. He gets an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th, no. That is 16th. Yeah, 16th Amendment. And that eventually goes through in 1913. So, I don't know why that's there. That's wrong. Right 16th. So, he gets it. His big political problem, though, is that he is not as good as a balancer of the reformers and the conservatives within the Republican Party. He is much less patient than Roosevelt. He is not as good of a kind of ego manager, basically. So the Republican Party split becomes much more dangerous in Taft's term. So a lot of the more kind of conservative-minded Republicans start breaking away from Taft. So the election of 1912 is very dangerous for Taft. And eventually, ironically, the biggest critic of Taft becomes Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt said that he wasn't running Congress well, he is splitting the party. So Roosevelt comes back in the election of 1912 and wants to be the Republican nominee again. He wants to get back into the White House for a third term in office, basically. And this splits the Republicans. And there are really three guys running for the Republican nomination in 1912. There's another guy from governor of Wisconsin named Robert La Follette. He's one of the big progressive types of politicians nationally. So you really have a three-way race for the Republican nomination in 1912. Eventually, through a lot of backdoor dealing, Taft is renominated. Even though Roosevelt appears to be more popular with the people, the high-level political decision makers renominate Roosevelt or renominate Taft, and Roosevelt's not too happy about it. So he decides to start up a third party that he calls the Progressive Party. Some textbooks will call it the Bull Moose Party, because that was their symbol. And Roosevelt will run for the presidency in the general election against Taft and the Democratic nominee, a guy named Woodrow Wilson. And eventually, the Republican vote amongst the people is split between Roosevelt and Taft. And that's what this cartoon depicts on the left side. The Republicans split in their vote. The Republicans were so obsessed with the differences between Roosevelt and Taft that they split their vote in almost all of the states. And that allows Wilson to, even though he doesn't get a majority of the popular vote, Wilson only gets about 42% of the popular vote. But if you look at the popular vote between Roosevelt and Taft, they would have been enough to win fairly easily if it was just one guy running, if one or the other had given in. So in splitting their party vote in virtually all of the states, the Democratic nominee got more votes in most of the states, and even though he got a less than a majority of the popular vote, he gets an overwhelming amount of the electoral vote. from the states. Does that make sense? And that's one of the big kinds of things that are still kind of powerful in presidential politics today. Who did President Obama run against for the nomination for the Democratic Party in 2012? Nobody. And there were a lot of Democrats who wanted to run against him. And they were told by the Democratic National Party, the party leaders, if you run against Obama and you threaten to do this, to split the Democratic Party vote, we will destroy you politically. You will never get Democratic Party money again, and you will never win another elective office for the rest of your life. And we know that from insider discussions, and a lot of Democrats are very unhappy about that. But the Democrats were very much afraid of this kind of thing. So, Wilson walks into the presidency. He's elected in 12, is inaugurated in March of 13. And the election of 1912 is important because you get a general argument, especially from Roosevelt, about what the national government should do. And he gives a major speech called The New Nationalism, where he defines a lot of aspects of what he believes the national government should be and how it should protect the people. And it's one of the optional reading responses. So it's up there, in the library site, up on the website. The New Nationalism was literally a speech he gave as he traveled around. He got huge audiences. And it's probably one of the most important statements politically in the early 1900s that any American politician gives about the vision of what the United States government should be. The major points are listed here. Big business is good. Again, his old idea. Big business is good if it doesn't harm the national interest. Big business has to be regulated by the federal government in order to guarantee that they're not harming the people, the national interest. The federal government has to be strong enough legally to intervene, to break up companies or regulate them so that they don't get out of control and, say, destroy the national economy or, today the worldwide economy. He says monopolies can be useful, but rarely. Monopolies are usually pretty destructive forces. But he says theoretically they can be good sometimes. So sometimes they can exist if they do good things for the people, but monopolies, just as they tend to function in reality, don't. They tend to function for their own enrichment as much as possible. And he starts talking about social welfare systems. And he says that they are generally a good thing for society, as long as the people that are accepting welfare, like unemployment insurance or unemployment compensation, don't become dependent on it. And his big statement, his big example is, if you're walking down the street and you see a homeless person, sitting in the gutter or up against a building or something like that, and as you walk past them, they put up their hand and ask for your help to pick them up and get them walking again. Roosevelt says it's a good thing, it's a humanitarian thing to help that person stand again on their own feet. But Roosevelt says, when you put down your hand and you start picking that person up, if they just lay down and they want you to drag them down the street and get them a job and do all these things for them, clean them up and everything, if they're not willing to put forward their own effort, Roosevelt says, screw them. If they're not willing to help themselves also, if they just want to lean on others, then those people are not kind of energetic or ambitious enough to ever really be helped. And you still see similar arguments circulating today, in especially presidential election year. You're seeing those kinds of statements on a daily basis. When Wilson runs for office in 1912, he has to counter those ideas because he's the other candidate on the ballot, or one of the other candidates. So Wilson comes out in his speeches with what he calls the new freedom. So much like Coke and Pepsi, they just take the same idea and they just put a different name on it. So Wilson's major policy statements as a candidate are the destruction of monopolies. Completely. He says monopolies, they might be able to do something good, but usually they don't, so we're just going to go after and break them up. Elect me, I will continue the trust busting. And he wants to use the federal government to ensure competition amongst different businesses. And going all the way back to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, you have to have competition for capitalism to really function well. You have to have many businesses in competition with each other for your purchasing power, for your dollars. Because when you have many businesses, they basically Walmart each other. They lower their prices to get you to buy their stuff instead of someone else's. And when you have competition, same thing with workers. They have to offer to pay the best workers the highest wages in order to get the best workers working for their company. So in just general capitalist theory, you need competition. And Wilson was no stranger to that. He understood it, he accepted it, and he promoted it actively as a candidate. He says he wants to lower tariffs, the taxes on imports, because if you lower tariffs, that means that the American companies that are selling their stuff for just below tariff prices, they would also have to lower their prices. So he says it's good for everybody, good for the consumer. But Wilson took a hard stand against social welfare ideas. He said, not under my presidency. He said, I don't support that at all. People have to help themselves, get their own jobs. So Wilson, that seems to be the major difference between Wilson and Roosevelt and Taft. So Wilson wants a government that has regulation powers, especially regulation over monopolies, but he doesn't want to expand the government to be a kind of what we call today social welfare type government, or what we call today the welfare state, where much of government expenditure is to support unemployed workers or build a giant kind of public infrastructure or something. Colleges back then were largely not funded by government. There was no Social Security, there was no unemployment insurance. So that eliminates a lot of what the government spends on today. And Wilson said he is a small government type of person. So questions about any of that at all? Yeah.
Who funds these kind of campaigns, or kind of more going toward smaller businesses and stuff like that?
It's still overwhelmingly the rich. The average workers don't make enough money to supply nearly as much money as really the super rich did back then and today. If you look at the Obama campaign's numbers from last month that they put out publicly yesterday, they said, I think it was something like 98% of all the donors gave less than $250. But they somehow raised $100 million in 1 month, which indicates to people who watch these numbers that that 2% of their donors are giving far above $250 each. I mean, you're talking millionaires and billionaires. And there are some donors that are writing checks for $10 million each to some of these candidates. Why? Because they want to control the candidates if they win, if they get into office. And one interesting thing to always note is there are especially internet sites that publish the list of donors for each party, for all of the parties. And when you compare the Republicans and Democrats, they're almost always not just the same industries, but the same companies overwhelmingly contribute to both parties. So what does that tell you? They want control no matter who wins. I mean, the Democratic Party and the Obama campaign in 2008 took in huge amounts of money from the health insurance industry and from Wall Street. And you wonder why health insurance laws and Wall Street regulation laws are so watered down. And the Wall Street regulation law that he put through in, 2010, basically hasn't even started functioning yet. And doesn't look like it will. Because it was so badly written. Why is it badly written? Because of power relations, because of control. And money is power. All right. So Wilson, though, because of the Republican split, Wilson gets into office fairly easily. Wilson starts doing things. He lowers tariffs. One of his big campaign promises, he actually expands the executive powers, the powers of the presidency, which was something he said that he campaigned against. He was a small government guy, but when he gets into government, he wants government to be strong, which is generally something we see with most presidential campaigns. When they win, they get into office. When they ran for office, they say small government. When they get into office, they use government for big, powerful things. So Wilson goes in and he actually expands the presidency even further to get laws passed through Congress that he wanted. He also benefited from the creation of the income tax. He goes into office in March of 1913. The income tax amendment to the Constitution gets approved in 1913. So even though Taft largely spent a huge amount of effort in his first term getting that thing passed, Taft never gets to use it because he's knocked out. Wilson is the one who benefits from it. So even though Wilson lowers tariffs, the first income tax that goes into effect is a 7% tax on basically the richest 5% of people in the country. The working class does not pay the income tax for quite a while. And the highest tax rate is 7%. Does anyone know what the highest tax rate is today? The highest incomes over $360,000 a year? 35%. So it has grown, and in the 1970s it was 70%. So it tended to grow fairly dramatically, and then was largely cut in half pretty much in the 1980s. So, there we go, 16th Amendment. I can do things right. In 1913, he also forced through the Federal Reserve Act with several very important, powerful members of Congress. This created the Federal Reserve System, a new national bank. The United States had not had an official government entity type of bank since the 1830s. Banks were printing their own money. So this law, in theory, was created to give the power of printing money, dollar bills, to one bank that became known as the Federal Reserve. It is a private bank. It is not run by government. So a private bank like Bank of America, but much larger and more powerful because they have the power over how much money circulates, is a private entity that prints your dollars right down to today. And they can choose to print as much as they want or as little as they want. It's their choice under this law. I think it sets up something like 7 or 10 different Federal Reserve banks throughout the country. And each of those banks has a kind of board of governors, each of those kind of regional banks. And there's a national board of governors. And the President of the United States nominates the Federal Reserve kind of chief board member, the guy who really makes the big decisions, or the person who really makes the big decisions. That position is nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. So there is some kind of government control over who runs this system, but it is completely a private bank. And it's something a lot of people don't realize today. They think because it's called the Federal Reserve Bank, it is a government entity. It is not. And something that is hugely controversial today, and has been for a long, long time. The controversy is basically that the big bankers of the country pushed this through and basically wrote the law themselves and just forced Congress people to vote for it. So questions about any of those? The Highway Act to build national road system, national highways. The Adamson Act sets an 8-hour limit on work days for railroad workers. So it only hits them, their industry, but it serves as an example for the rest of industries to set an 8-hour workday. And anything worked over that is considered overtime. It's supposed to be voluntary. The McGill-Cuddy Act creates a workers' compensation system, again, only for federal employees. So if you're injured on the job as a federal employee or something happens and you're laid off, you can get some kind of financial help, at least for the short term. Again, it only hits federal employees with that law, but it serves as an example to many other industries. It is basically a government threat. We're going to do this here, so this is the first step. If your own industry doesn't volunteer to do this yourself, government is going to pass laws for your industry also. And a lot of this stuff, and especially the Federal Farm Act, this allowed the federal government to give loans from the federal treasury, from the federal tax revenue, to farmers at very low interest rates, so that they could get mortgages on a deal. They didn't have to go to these giant banks. They're going to charge them, 20, 30% interest. That would probably get them foreclosed on eventually. So they could get access to federal loans at low interest. So this stuff was popular amongst major different support parts of the reform kind of movement population. And along with his promise in 1916 to keep the United States out of the war in Europe, eventually it becomes known as World War I. These are the things that get him reelected in 1916. So he will serve a second term. And most of his second term is dominated by the war. And we'll talk about that, was it next week after the test. So questions on any of these? No. All right. Moving forward. Okay. Now we're going to get into just some examples of these different progressive movements. Because again, the progressive movement is not one unified movement of all people voting for something. It is a patchwork of different groups that had different demands. There was a kind of league of women suffragists who want to get the voting rights for women. There is a group that want to improve meatpacking standards in certain cities. So there's a whole bunch of different kind of civic-minded groups, communities, that organize themselves and start, collecting like dues. When you sign up to join an organization, you give them $1 or $2, and they build up a money base that they use to try to publish newsletters or knock politicians out of office that are opposed to what they want. So they use their own financial resources, the resources of the working people, to enforce things through Congress. And any Congress member who votes against what they want, they will organize voters to knock that person out of office. So this idea of progressivism is almost entirely a movement from below, a grassroots movement from organizing people. It's not led by politicians so much. Politicians have to react and respond to this public pressure. And that's how you start getting these laws passed. And again, it is almost entirely an organized reaction to the excesses of the 1800s. Industrialization and its damages to society. All of the bad working conditions, all the low wages, child labor, all kinds of different things. And this is when people finally realize that they have to organize to fight back. And the way they fight back is to vote people out if they don't accept their demands. And they start voting out politicians who were social Darwinists, who wanted to allow the rich to rise up to the highest levels of wealth and power. Thought that was a good thing. And they start voting out the French term, laissez-faire capitalism, which means government should just sit back and let the economy run and let businesses do whatever they want. So they start voting those politicians out of office, and that's where you get the reformers that go in and start passing these laws. So there's a whole lot of different groups with a whole lot of different demands, and the key is organization. Much as a lot of reform-minded people argue today. You're not going to get laws passed through two largely corrupted major political parties without a large grassroots movement from below. And those are historically the kinds of movements that have largely changed this country. From the end of slavery to the Progressive Era and to the Civil Rights movements. Politicians didn't want to accept that stuff, but they were forced to, or they were removed. One of the major ones, even Christian groups get involved in this. And they start interpreting their reading of the Bible to imply that they are supposed to help the poor and destitute, the poor and the hungry in society. And this grows out of church groups. And it becomes known in the progressive era as the social gospel movement. The idea that a lot of things that Jesus is quoted as saying in the Bible should be implemented politically for the support of the working and the hungry masses, the largely exploited and victimized people of society. So they take the idea of feeding the hungry and clothing the poor, and they demand that of their politicians. And the general term, this guy Gladden is one of the major leaders of it. He became a kind of national symbol of this movement. The term they used was applied Christianity. Christianity, in theory, is supposed to do good things for the average person, and especially for poor people. And they said, we are going to apply it like a machine. Just like if you go and study mathematics. Engineering is a kind of applied mathematics, right? They use calculus and such things to make your cell phones. They use physics to put things into space. They take theories of how the natural world operates, and they figure out how to build something with those theories. And that's what's happening here. They're taking theories within Christianity and trying to get laws passed, build something for society to put these ideas into effect. Another major group were the reporters who did investigations and largely got hired into factories. Upton Sinclair is one of the most famous of these writers. They become known as muckrakers eventually because they publish all the crap of society. They put it on the front page. They publish books about it. They do interviews about it. They throw it in the face of the American people. This is how dirty your society has become. This is how dangerous, especially the food supply, has become. And say, you shouldn't have to put up with this. And the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous of these works. And if you ever read it, it's just absolutely disgusting. This is about the meatpacking industry, and I think it's Chicago. And all the horrible things that not just the workers had to put up with, but all the rotten meat that got processed and all the, a lot of danger to public health just as a result of the bad business practices. So a lot of this stuff was focused on the meatpacking industry, the food supply, focused on railroads, because farmers are still viewing railroads as kind of leeches that are harming society overwhelmingly. A lot of oil companies also. This is where attacks go against Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's company, and Standard Oil is broken up into several smaller companies. And the Bell Telephone Company is broken up. And a lot of these guys, because they had college degrees, they applied to go work for some of these corporations as mid-level managers. And they would go work there for a few months or a year or something and get the inside idea of what's actually happening within that company. And then they would quit and go write a book about it and publish the book as an attack on the company. And because this is where, in the early 1900s, you're starting to see the really powerful universal education of children. This is where laws start getting passed to eliminate child labor and take kids out of those factories and put them in school so that most of society will at least know how to read on a basic elementary level. So if most people at least know how to read, they can pick up one of these books and read about what's really happening in the most powerful structures in the country. Sinclair becomes so popular, he's elected governor of California, or nearly elected governor of California. He has a long political career for 30 years after that book's published. So he becomes a reformed politician himself. Okay, there's other ones. Women start, even though they don't have the right to vote yet, they start organizing to get certain things that they want. And they used this image of domesticity, the idea that women are the kind of repositories of morality, and they are the kind of guardians of all that is good and pure in society. They used that image to their advantage politically to convince men to vote for what they want. And they want a whole lot of different things. They are largely the kind of organizing force that pushes for child education in the late 1800s, especially. They want, obviously, working rights for women and children. This is where you start getting child labor laws. Cannot employ children under a certain age. And the argument starts getting put forth that women are just as good workers as men in a lot of ways, and they should be paid equally, which still hasn't happened in the United States. Women today in the United States are still paid 75% of what men are paid for the exact same job. So there's still a lot of inequality. And eventually they push for voting rights for women, which they get, and I believe it's 1919. And I think it's the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So another major piece of reform legislation that gets written into the Constitution itself. So they redefine the word voter, as they have done in the Constitution several times. One of their major leaders was a kind of former nurse named Margaret Sanger, and she pushed for reproductive rights, basically contraception, and eventually getting toward arguments for legalized abortion. She said that without access to contraception for women, that when women get married, usually around kind of late teenage, early 20s years, they very quickly became pregnant for obvious reasons. They go on honeymoon or something, right? And they end up pregnant within a few months of getting married. And Sanger called this enforced motherhood because they had no ability to stop it. Well, they had one ability, but that's usually not very popular, especially with younger people, right? Yeah. So she is a major, gives a major argument for kinds of birth control, to the point where she's eventually ostracized from American society. And she has to leave the United States for quite a few years. But she is seen as one of the major kind of early demands for contraception, which eventually becomes fully legalized 1950s, and the pill gets invented, I think, in the early 60s. I have to look that one up. But it's a long, long fight. And especially the social gospel idea. Oh, yeah.
What kind of health effects does early birth control have?
What kind of health effects?
Yeah.
It wasn't negative usually. It was usually pretty positive. They weren't damaging themselves to avoid it, put it that way. It wasn't a dangerous thing, and that was the major argument. That if women want to make that choice, it's not going to hurt them. But who are the ones? What's the major group that argues against contraception and still today? The Catholic Church. They view it as a sin to stop that from happening in a lot of ways. So you still get that argument going forth today. Another movement that gets started is called the Moral Reform Movement, which is very much supported by women who especially don't like the fact that their husbands are drinking away their paychecks and getting violent. So you start getting movements to try to outlaw, especially a lot of the worst kind of rampant drugs in society, like the opiates, heroin, cocaine. This is where you get the national laws that make those drugs illegal. This is where you also get the movement toward full prohibition and the creation of making prostitution illegal. And eventually it becomes known as prohibition against alcohol. And that gets written to the Constitution also. That becomes a constitutional amendment. And I believe that's the 20th. But that literally makes it illegal to make, possess, transport, or sell alcohol in the United States, unless you had a very special permit, which some like the Catholic Church argue for a permit because they use wine, right, in their religious ceremonies. So Catholicism grew very quickly when Prohibition went in. The numbers of the Catholic churches skyrocketed because everyone wants to get this permit. But that's one of the funny kind of results of that. Is Prohibition successful? Absolutely not. People break it pretty consistently, and it becomes almost unenforceable, much like the illegal drug movement did back then and today. When people want to do a lot of this stuff, they're going to find a way, and they will pay heavy prices to do it. And there's a real good documentary that came out on Prohibition, I think a year or two ago. And it's very long, but it traces the history of this anti-alcohol movement all the way from the mid-1800s. It really became powerful in the mid-1800s because the hard liquors became much, much heavier with alcohol content in about the 1860s, 1870s because of chemical refineries than they were in the 1700s. So they were much more dangerous and much more inebriating very quickly in the late 1800s than they had ever been before. So that's Prohibition. Eventually is repealed in 1933. Interestingly, right in the depths of the Great Depression, when apparently a whole lot of people wanted to drink and there's nothing you could do to stop them. So eventually when the Democratic Party goes back into power in 1933, they repeal it fairly quickly, immediately. And another major social group are African Americans, who obviously understand that they are an entirely repressed part of the population, not just in the South, but also in the North. Even in the city of Baltimore, a pretty far northern city, that's right next to Washington, D.C., the national capital. For many decades, into the 1950s even, it was illegal for black people and white people to swim in the same pool at a hotel. So these kinds of racisms are not just prevalent in the South. They're most dangerous and most destructive, most violent in the South, but they're also very much in effect in the North and in the West, and also very violent in those areas too. You have major lynching movements in New York City. So African American leaders start getting together, largely under Du Bois's leadership, to create the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Again, not just African Americans, but any basically non-white people who are completely disenfranchised in the country. And they try to push for civil rights. Doesn't work for a long time because there is such heavy resistance from the white population and the voting population. So politicians for a long, long, long time will not listen very much to these leaders. They'll have meetings with them every once in a while, but they won't actually do anything. They'll make promises, but they won't do anything. Which is what politicians honestly do very often, right? They make promises and then they just avoid doing anything. They'll give you all the nice speeches about what they want to do, and then for some reason it just doesn't happen. So my advice to voters is, and to anyone watching this stuff, is to always judge your politicians based on their actions. What have they actually done? Not their promises. Anyone can promise anything. And the more promises they break, take your risk in voting for those kinds of people. They're not going to actually do what they say. What's the point in voting for them, right?